Sarah Martinez had lived her entire 25 years in the small town of Cedar Valley, where everyone knew everyone's business. Born deaf, she had learned to navigate a world that often forgot she existed. Her parents, Maria and Carlos, had immigrated from Mexico when Sarah was just 2 years old, carrying dreams of a better life and the hope that America might offer more opportunities for their special daughter. The Martinez family ran a small bakery on Main Street, where Sarah worked alongside her mother every morning before dawn. Her hands moved with practiced grace, kneading dough and decorating cakes with an artistic flair that had made their bakery famous throughout the county. Sarah communicated through sign language with her family and lip reading with customers who were patient enough to face her when they spoke. Her dark eyes held an intelligence that many people missed because they were too focused on what she couldn't hear. Sarah had grown accustomed to the pitying looks and the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. She knew what people said about her behind her back. Poor Sarah, such a pretty girl, but who would want to marry someone like that? How could she raise children? How could she keep a house safe? The whispers followed her like shadows, and though she couldn't hear them, she could read lips well enough to catch fragments that stung her heart. Despite the challenges, Sarah had built a rich life for herself. She read voraciously, consuming novels and poetry that transported her to worlds beyond Cedar Valley. She painted landscapes during her free time, capturing the rolling hills and vast skies that surrounded their town. Her artwork hung in the bakery, and tourists often tried to buy pieces, though Sarah rarely sold them. These paintings were her voice, her way of showing the world the beauty she saw when words failed her. The bakery attracted customers from neighboring ranches, and Sarah had learned to recognize the faces that came and went with the seasons. There were the Johnson brothers, who always ordered apple turnovers for their workers during harvest time. Mrs. Henderson, who bought bread every Tuesday and always made sure to speak slowly and clearly to Sarah. And then there was Thomas Reed, a rancher who owned the largest spread outside of town. Thomas was different from the other men who frequented the bakery. He was 32, tall and lean from years of working under the sun. His calloused hands spoke of honest labor, and his weathered face held kindness in every line. Unlike most customers who ordered quickly and left, Thomas took his time. He had learned basic sign language somewhere along the way, though Sarah didn't know where or why. When he ordered his weekly supplies of bread and pastries for his ranch hands, he signed simple greetings and thank yous that never failed to surprise her. The Reed Ranch had been in Thomas's family for 3 generations. His grandfather had homesteaded the land in the 1890s, and his father had expanded it into one of the most successful cattle operations in the region. When Thomas inherited the ranch 5 years ago after his father's sudden heart attack, many people expected him to fail. He was young, unmarried, and had spent 4 years away at agricultural college instead of learning the business hands-on, like most ranchers' sons. But Thomas had proved the doubters wrong. He implemented new breeding techniques he had learned in college, rotated his pastures to prevent overgrazing, and treated his workers with respect and fair wages. The Reed Ranch now employed 15 full-time hands and provided seasonal work for many local families during roundup and branding season. Thomas had earned respect through his actions, but he remained modest about his success. What people didn't know about Thomas was that he had learned sign language during his college years. His roommate's younger sister was deaf, and Thomas had spent many holidays and summers with their family. He witnessed firsthand how society underestimated deaf individuals and how much they had to offer when given the chance. This experience had shaped his perspective in ways that would prove significant. Every Wednesday morning, Thomas made the 20-minute drive from his ranch to the Martinez bakery. It had started as a practical arrangement when he first took over the ranch. The bakery's bread was better than anything he could find at the grocery store, and their pastries boosted morale among his workers. But over the past 2 years, Wednesday mornings had become the highlight of his week for entirely different reasons. Sarah noticed how Thomas always timed his visits for the quieter morning hours, when the early rush had ended but the lunch crowd hadn't yet arrived. He never seemed hurried, never tapped his fingers impatiently or checked his watch like other customers. Instead, he would study the display cases thoughtfully, sometimes asking about new items or complimenting her mother on the day's selection. Their interactions began with simple exchanges. Thomas would point to what he wanted, and Sarah would write down the total on a small pad she kept by the register. But gradually, he began incorporating sign language into their conversations. At first, just basic words like good morning and thank you. Then simple questions about the weather or comments about her paintings on the wall. Sarah was initially suspicious of his efforts. She had encountered too many people who learned a few signs thinking it would be cute or novel, only to lose interest when they realized deaf culture was more complex than gestures. But Thomas was different. His signing improved steadily, and he never seemed frustrated when communication broke down. Instead, he would patiently try different approaches until they understood each other. One particularly memorable Wednesday, Thomas arrived to find Sarah arranging a new painting on the wall behind the counter. It was a sunset scene from the hills above town, painted in warm oranges and deep purples that seemed to glow even in the bakery's fluorescent lighting. He stood transfixed for several minutes, studying the brushwork and the way Sarah had captured the light. When Sarah noticed his attention, she blushed and tried to continue her work, but Thomas stepped closer to the counter. Using a combination of signs and gestures, he told her how beautiful the painting was. Then he did something that surprised her completely. He pulled out his phone and showed her a photo of the same view from his ranch, taken just a week earlier during an evening ride to check on his cattle. The realization that they both treasured the same vista created an unexpected connection between them. Thomas explained through gestures and written notes that he often rode to that exact spot when he needed to think or find peace after difficult days. Sarah wrote back that she hiked there regularly to paint and watch the sunset. They had been sharing the same sacred space without knowing it. From that day forward, their Wednesday morning conversations grew longer and more personal. Thomas began arriving with a small notebook where he had written questions or comments in advance, knowing that lip reading could be challenging in the morning light that streamed through the bakery windows. Sarah appreciated his thoughtfulness and began preparing her own notes to share stories about her paintings, her family, or interesting customers she had encountered. Maria Martinez watched these developing interactions with a mixture of hope and concern. She had seen men show interest in Sarah before, only to fade away when the reality of communicating with a deaf person became inconvenient. But Thomas seemed genuinely committed to learning and improving his sign language skills. He never spoke to Maria or Carlos about Sarah as if she weren't present, a common occurrence that always frustrated the family. Instead, he addressed Sarah directly and included her in every conversation. Carlos was more skeptical. As Sarah's father, he had watched too many people patronize his daughter with temporary kindness. He appreciated Thomas's business and respectful manner, but he worried about his daughter's heart. Sarah had been hurt before by people who seemed accepting until faced with the real challenges of communicating with someone who couldn't hear. Carlos didn't want to see her endure that disappointment again. Sarah herself was confused by her growing feelings for Thomas. She had always assumed she would marry someone from the deaf community, if she married at all. The idea of building a life with a hearing person seemed fraught with complications. How would they communicate during arguments? How would he feel about having deaf children? Would he grow tired of constantly accommodating her needs? But Thomas's consistent kindness and genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions made her reconsider her assumptions. He never spoke louder or more slowly, understanding that volume was irrelevant for someone who couldn't hear. He faced her when he spoke, kept his mouth clear, and never covered his lips with his hands. These small courtesies, which meant everything to Sarah, seemed natural for him rather than forced accommodations. As autumn approached, their friendship deepened beyond the confines of Wednesday morning visits. Thomas began stopping by the bakery on other days, sometimes with legitimate errands for his workers, but often just to see Sarah. He would bring her wildflowers from the ranch property or photos of interesting cloud formations he thought she might want to paint. Sarah found herself looking forward to these unexpected visits with anticipation that surprised her. She began wearing her favorite dress more often and taking extra care with her hair, telling herself it was just good business practice, but knowing the truth was more complicated. When Thomas didn't appear for several days, due to ranch emergencies, she felt his absence more keenly than she wanted to admit. The turning point came on a crisp October morning when Thomas arrived at the bakery with news that would change everything. He had been accepted into a livestock management program that would take him away from the ranch for 6 weeks during the winter. The program was an incredible opportunity that could significantly improve his operation, but it meant leaving Cedar Valley just as their friendship was blossoming. Thomas struggled to explain his mixed feelings about the opportunity. Through their usual combination of signs, notes, and gestures, he told Sarah about the program's benefits for his ranch and his animals. But his expression revealed his reluctance to leave, and Sarah understood that his hesitation had nothing to do with the program itself. For the first time, Sarah directly addressed the growing connection between them. She wrote in his notebook that she was happy for his opportunity and that 6 weeks would pass quickly. But her own expression betrayed her disappointment, and Thomas saw through her encouraging words to the sadness beneath. That morning, they both realized their friendship had evolved into something deeper and more complicated. Neither spoke directly about their feelings, but the awareness hung between them like morning mist that would eventually lift to reveal the landscape underneath. Thomas left the bakery that day with his usual order of bread and pastries, but both he and Sarah knew their relationship had shifted into uncertain territory. As Thomas drove back to his ranch, he found himself making a decision that would surprise everyone, including himself. The livestock management program could wait. There were some things more important than improving cattle yields and implementing new breeding techniques. Sometimes a man had to choose between advancing his business and pursuing something that might change his entire life. Sarah spent the rest of that day thinking about Thomas's upcoming departure and what it might mean for their friendship. She had grown comfortable with their regular interactions, but his absence would reveal just how much space he had begun to occupy in her daily thoughts. As she helped her mother prepare the next day's bread, Sarah realized she was facing a choice of her own about whether to guard her heart or risk the vulnerability that comes with caring deeply about someone. The town of Cedar Valley was about to witness a love story that would challenge everyone's assumptions about what was possible when two people truly saw and valued each other beyond surface differences. The following Wednesday, Thomas walked into the Martinez bakery with his usual confident stride, but Sarah immediately noticed something different in his demeanor. Instead of approaching the counter with his customary warm smile, he seemed nervous, almost hesitant. He lingered by the door for a moment, adjusting his hat and running his hand through his hair in a gesture Sarah had never seen before. When he finally approached the counter, Thomas pulled out his notebook, but instead of writing his usual order, he had prepared a longer message. Sarah read the carefully written words with growing surprise. "I've decided not to take the livestock program. Some opportunities come along once in a lifetime, but the right people in your life are even rarer. I was hoping we could spend more time together if you'd like that." Sarah stared at the notebook for a long moment, reading the words twice to make sure she understood correctly. Thomas had given up a significant professional opportunity, and he was telling her it was because of their friendship. The weight of his decision settled over her like a warm blanket on a cold morning, bringing both comfort and responsibility. She picked up her pen and wrote back, "Are you sure about the program? It sounded important for your ranch." But even as she wrote the words, her heart was singing with joy that he wanted to stay. Thomas's response was immediate and decisive. He wrote, "The ranch has been successful for generations without that program. But I've never met anyone who sees the world the way you do. I'd like to learn more about that world, if you'll teach me." From that moment, their relationship began to evolve in ways that both excited and worried Sarah. Thomas started visiting the bakery almost daily, always with some legitimate purpose, but clearly motivated by the desire to see her. He would arrive during slower periods, when they could have longer conversations without keeping other customers waiting. Their communication improved dramatically as Thomas dedicated himself to learning sign language properly. He borrowed books from the library, found online resources, and even drove to the city to attend sign language classes at the community college. Sarah was amazed by his commitment and touched by the effort he was making to enter her world rather than expecting her to adapt entirely to his. Maria Martinez watched these developments with growing affection for Thomas. She appreciated how he always greeted her and Carlos warmly, asking about their health and the bakery's business. He treated Sarah's parents with the respect due to potential in-laws, though no formal understanding existed between him and Sarah. Maria began teaching him phrases in Spanish as well, delighting in his enthusiasm for learning everything about Sarah's cultural background. Carlos remained more cautious, but even he was beginning to warm to Thomas. The rancher had proven his staying power, showing up consistently despite communication challenges and never displaying impatience or frustration. When Thomas asked Carlos's permission to take Sarah to dinner at the town's nicest restaurant, Carlos found himself saying yes before he had time to worry about all the things that could go wrong. Their first official date was a revelation for both of them. Thomas had called the restaurant in advance, explaining Sarah's deafness and asking for a quiet table with good lighting where they could see each other clearly. The staff was accommodating, seating them by a window where the natural light made lip reading easier and providing written menus without being asked. During dinner, they discovered how much they had in common beyond their mutual appreciation for sunsets. Both loved reading, though Sarah preferred fiction, while Thomas enjoyed biographies and agricultural journals. They shared a passion for the outdoors and a deep connection to the land around Cedar Valley. Thomas told Sarah about his dreams for expanding the ranch sustainably, while Sarah shared her hope of someday illustrating children's books. As their relationship progressed, the town began to take notice. Cedar Valley was small enough that any new romance became public knowledge quickly, but this particular pairing generated more interest than usual. Some residents were genuinely happy for Sarah, knowing how limited her social opportunities had been. Others were more skeptical, wondering how such a relationship could possibly work long-term. The skepticism reached Sarah's ears through friends and family members who felt compelled to share what people were saying. Mrs. Patterson at the post office wondered aloud how Thomas could truly know what he was getting into. Mr. Johnson from the feed store questioned whether the relationship was fair to either of them. Even some of Sarah's former teachers expressed concern about the practical challenges they would face. These doubts began to weigh on Sarah's mind, especially during quiet moments when she wasn't distracted by Thomas's presence or her work at the bakery. She started wondering if the people expressing concern were right. Was she being selfish by allowing Thomas to become so invested in a relationship that might prove too difficult in the long run? Was he making a mistake by committing to someone who would require constant accommodation? Thomas sensed Sarah's growing anxiety, though she tried to hide it from him. Their conversations became more stilted, and she seemed distracted during their time together. When he pressed her gently about what was troubling her, Sarah finally shared the concerns that people had been expressing about their relationship. Thomas listened carefully as Sarah explained the doubts that were plaguing her. Through a combination of signs and written notes, she told him about the practical questions people were raising. How would they communicate effectively during emergencies? How would they raise children together? How would she manage as a ranch wife when so much of rural life depended on hearing things like approaching vehicles or animals in distress? Instead of dismissing these concerns, Thomas acknowledged their validity while explaining why he believed they could overcome any challenge together. He had already begun researching assistive technologies that could help with ranch management. There were visual alert systems for detecting approaching vehicles and specialized equipment for monitoring livestock. More importantly, he had observed how Sarah's other senses had become heightened to compensate for her hearing loss. She noticed details that he missed and had an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that impressed experienced ranchers. But the doubts persisted. Fed by well-meaning friends and community members who continued to question whether their relationship was practical or fair. The turning point came during the annual Harvest Festival, Cedar Valley's biggest social event of the year. Sarah had been looking forward to attending with Thomas, but she was also nervous about facing the entire community as an official couple. The festival was held in the town park, with booths selling local crafts and food, games for children, and a dance floor set up under string lights that would illuminate the evening festivities. Sarah wore her best dress, a deep blue that brought out her eyes, and Thomas had traded his usual work clothes for pressed slacks and a button-down shirt that made him look almost formal. They spent the afternoon walking through the booths together, Thomas carrying Sarah's purchases and introducing her to ranchers and their wives she hadn't met before. Sarah was pleased to discover that Thomas's friends and business associates were uniformly welcoming, treating her with the same respect they showed any rancher's girlfriend. The trouble started during the early evening, when people began gathering near the bandstand for the traditional harvest blessing. Sarah and Thomas found seats on a bench near the back, where Sarah could see the speaker clearly for lip reading. They were enjoying the ceremony when Sarah noticed a group of women sitting nearby engaged in an animated conversation. Mrs. Fitzgerald, the banker's wife and self-appointed arbiter of social propriety, was holding court with several other women about the recent changes in town. Sarah couldn't hear their words, but their glances in her direction made it clear she was the topic of discussion. She tried to ignore them and focus on the blessing ceremony, but their continued staring made her uncomfortable. Thomas noticed Sarah's distraction and followed her gaze to the group of women. He could hear their conversation clearly, and what he heard made his jaw tighten with anger. Mrs. Fitzgerald was explaining to the other women how sorry she felt for Thomas, getting involved with someone who could never be a proper ranch wife. According to Mrs. Fitzgerald, the relationship was bound to fail once Thomas realized the limitations he would face. The conversation continued with increasingly hurtful speculations about Sarah's abilities and Thomas's motivations. Mrs. Fitzgerald suggested that Thomas was probably just being kind to Sarah out of pity and would eventually come to his senses. Another woman wondered aloud if Thomas truly understood what he would be giving up by tying himself to someone with such limitations. Then Mrs. Henley, the store owner's wife, made the comment that would change everything. Speaking loudly enough that several people nearby could hear, she said, "It's really quite sad when you think about it. I mean, she's deaf, and at 25 she's still unmarried. What kind of future can she really have? It's not like she can have children and raise them properly." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had heard enough cruel comments about Sarah to last a lifetime. But this direct attack on her worth as a woman and potential mother crossed a line he couldn't ignore. Without thinking, he stood up from the bench and walked directly over to the group of women. Sarah watched in confusion as Thomas approached Mrs. Henley's group. She couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see the shocked expressions on their faces as Thomas spoke. His body language radiated controlled anger, and his voice, though she couldn't hear it, was clearly firm and forceful. "Excuse me, Mrs. Henley," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about Sarah Martinez. You said she's deaf and unmarried, and you questioned whether she could have children and raise them properly." Mrs. Henley flushed red, realizing that Thomas had heard her cruel words. The other women in the group shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding their shoes extremely interesting. Several people nearby had stopped their own conversations to listen to this unexpected confrontation. Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You're right that Sarah is deaf, and you're right that she's currently unmarried. But you're completely wrong about what that means for her future. Sarah is one of the strongest, most capable women I've ever met. She runs a successful business, creates beautiful art, and has overcome more challenges than most people face in a lifetime." Mrs. Henley tried to interrupt, but Thomas held up his hand and continued speaking. "As for having children and raising them properly, I'd be honored to give her as many children as she wants. And those children would be incredibly fortunate to have a mother who understands struggle, shows resilience, and sees beauty in the world that others miss." The group of women sat in stunned silence as Thomas's words sank in. He had just publicly declared his intention to marry Sarah and start a family with her, addressing every concern and doubt that had been whispered about their relationship. More importantly, he had done it in a way that celebrated Sarah's strengths rather than apologizing for her perceived weaknesses. Thomas wasn't finished. Looking directly at Mrs. Henley, he added, "Sarah communicates more effectively with her hands than some people do with their voices. She listens more carefully with her eyes than most people do with their ears. And she has more love and kindness in her heart than people who spend their time gossiping about others' personal lives." The crowd that had gathered to listen was completely silent as Thomas delivered his final statement. "If you want to question someone's suitability for marriage and parenthood, you might want to look at whether they have the character to build up others rather than tear them down. By that measure, Sarah surpasses most people in this town." With that, Thomas turned and walked back to where Sarah was sitting, her eyes wide with shock and confusion about what had just transpired. He sat down beside her and took her hand, squeezing it gently as the crowd slowly began to disperse and resume their conversations. Sarah knew something significant had happened, but she couldn't understand what based on the fragments of conversation she had managed to lip-read from a distance. She looked at Thomas with questioning eyes, and he realized he would need to explain the entire encounter. Using their notebook, Thomas wrote a brief summary of Mrs. Henley's comment and his response. Sarah read his words with growing amazement, hardly believing that he had made such a public declaration of his feelings and intentions. When she reached the part about giving her children, tears began streaming down her face. Thomas immediately became concerned, worried that his bold statement had overwhelmed or upset her. But when Sarah looked up from the notebook, her tears were accompanied by the brightest smile he had ever seen. She reached for the pen and wrote, "Did you mean what you said about children and marriage?" Thomas took the notebook and wrote back without hesitation. "Every single word. I love you, Sarah Martinez, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that our differences make us stronger, not weaker." Sarah's response was immediate and decisive. Instead of writing in the notebook, she signed clearly for everyone nearby to see. "I love you too, Thomas Reed. Yes, to everything." The Harvest Festival continued around them, but for Sarah and Thomas, the rest of the world had faded away. They sat on their bench holding hands and talking through their notebooks about their future together, making plans that transformed Mrs. Henley's cruel doubts into a roadmap for building something beautiful.